Today's video is sponsored by Prime Gaming, the service that gives you a rotating stock of free games and in-game items as part of your Prime subscription. Later in the month, they'll be celebrating Prime Day, giving away a bunch of really cool titles. Stay tuned to learn more later in the video. Do you have any of those games that you used to play a long time ago and you're absolutely positive that you like them, but you don't exactly remember why? Well, I can tell you I have a lot of those games. Specifically, Mass Effect 3's multiplayer has always been the one that stood out to me though. I remember having a really good time with it, but I couldn't for the life of me give you any of the specific reasons why, beyond like a vague response of, I don't know, I recall having fun. So I decided, what the heck, it's July, there's not a lot of things going on in game right now, not a lot of big new titles. Why don't I take a revisit and see if my memory of having enjoyed this multiplayer holds up at all? So I did just that, and I was right. I really like this, but boy, does it have some like massive flaws and issues I totally forgot about, which we will get into. But first, let me take you back about a decade to when this game launched. The year was 2012. The highly anticipated third installment of the Mass Effect trilogy was just about to come out, and people were pumped. But then the unthinkable happened. News came through that EA forced BioWare in the later stages of development to tack on a multiplayer mode. By all accounts, this would be very rushed, not thoroughly thought through, and likely was only included so EA could begin its 10-year reign as the loot box champion. At the time, the internet was in a bit of an uproar. How dare they sully the pristine name of Mass Effect with some garbo multiplayer, people would said. At least I think they said that. And generally, a lot of the Mass Effect community was saddened, assuming that this was going to be taking time and development resources away from the single player and the story, and we all know how that turned out. And so, pretty much everyone expected that this last-minute addition of a multiplayer mode filled with loot boxes would be total forgettable trash. My God, how wrong we all were. Against all odds, Mass Effect 3's multiplayer was some of the most fun gaming I had that entire year. I went back and watched old videos and I could not stop gushing about this game. And it was such a pleasant surprise. Like it came out of nowhere. I wasn't expecting to get a fun multiplayer co-op horde mode experience out of a Mass Effect title. And I liked it so much that I ended up playing it day after day for quite some time. But yes, it did have like some serious problems. For one, it was a very simple horde mode. Like if you break down the core components, there really wasn't much to it. Matches consisted of 10 rounds where you would fight back increasingly difficult waves of enemies, trying to survive and then extracting on an 11th round. They mixed it up a little bit. Every few rounds you would be given an objective: escort a drone, recover an object, eliminate high-value targets, hack a terminal, or disable devices that were scattered around the level. Speaking of the levels, they were small, like very small, like only a few rooms each. You could circle any map in this mode in well under a minute. They were so tiny, not sprawling or complex or very layered at all. And to top all of that off, the main form of progression, unlocking characters, weapons, attachments, and consumables, was all tied behind loot boxes. In fact, there is nothing that you can earn that wasn't in a loot box. Even by today's standards of monetization, that was patently absurd. It was just crazy. However, as simple as the general structure was, as small as those levels were, despite the fact that this was, by the developer's own admission, a rushed addition to the game, and even though all the progression was put behind loot boxes, all of that is true, and yet it was incredibly fun. Like, I can't explain it. Well, I'll try. That's kind of the point of this video. So like I said, I recently decided to jump back in to try to see if my memory held up. And, you know, booting this up in 2022, I wasn't exactly sure what to expect. You know, what were the odds that anyone would still be playing this 10 years later? But to my surprise, I had zero issues getting into a game ever. In fact, queue times have been non-existent all week. If I hit find match, I am immediately pulled right into a game. It's incredible, honestly, that this mode is so well populated so long after this game came out. The fact that I can instantly find a party at any hour of the day, no matter what parameters I select, no matter the difficulty, the map, the enemy type, any combination of this, I'm just automatically finding a game. It's bananas. Although you should keep in mind that this could be platform specific. The Steam numbers for Mass Effect 3 look pretty dire the last time I checked, and I was playing on Origin, but at least here it was pretty simple to get into a game. I think it's also worth noting that before I jumped in, I had read that you needed to download all of the DLC packs before you could actually matchmake with anyone. Had I not done that, apparently I would have never found a party, which could lead me to assume that no one was playing, but it's just the fact that there was a compatibility issue if you didn't download the DLC packs. And the good news is that all of those are free, but it is just an extra step that you need to take that isn't spelled out for you in the game as of now. But if you jump into Mass Effect 3, you get those DLC packs. I have not ever had an issue finding a match. It blows my mind. There are games that release this year that are multiplayer that I can't even find lobbies for. But these things just fill up instantly no matter what. It's pretty crazy. Okay, so let's go ahead and cover some of the basics of the game itself, the multiplayer mode. When you first begin, the very first thing you have to do is pick a character. So you're gonna start off with access to essentially the simple versions of every single class. Classes in this game fill various archetypes and playstyles. So there are 6 classes. They are the Adept, which is kind of a bit of a glass cannon. These use biotics and will debuff enemies while also dealing massive damage. There's the Soldier. This is a well-rounded, versatile character. He's got weapon enhancements and self-buffs. The Engineer are tech specialists who can summon drones, debuff, and hack enemies. There's the Sentinel, which mixes tech and biotics. This is kind of more of the supportive class. Infiltrator is all about invisibility, sniping. They're also capable of huge melee damage from stealth. These are the nimble characters. And then finally, there is the Vanguard, a close-range brawler with a teleport. They like to use things like shotguns, and just in general, they want to be on the front lines. Now, these basic attributes of the 6 classes are kind of the general template, but things go way more in depth once you consider all of the characters that there are to unlock, and the fact that each of them add new active and passive abilities that can really change up how you play and what you can do with the characters, but I'll touch on that a little bit more in just a moment. Okay, so you pick one of the starter classes and then you select your loadout. You'll pick from whatever weapons you have access to. You can equip up to 2 weapons at any time, choosing from a sniper, AR, SMG, shotgun, and pistol. And then beyond that, they will have different styles and strengths, but also there is a weight system. The heavier the weapon, the slower your cooldowns. Or, glass half full perspective, the lighter the weapons, the faster your cooldowns. So if you're looking to use a lot of skills constantly, if you've buffed up your powers in that direction, you'll want to find lighter weapons to equip, or even just go in with 1 light weapon for the fastest possible recharge times. Or if you plan to mostly shoot things, the heavier weapons are going to be packing more of a punch, and those will be a good decision to equip. This is all further enhanced by the upgrade paths that every class has, which pretty much boils down to you get to choose, do you want to shoot or cast spells better? And then on top of that, there are also mods for your weapons and a system of equipment to further boost your strength in a particular run. You unlock all of this stuff by engaging with the worst part of the multiplayer, the loot boxes, which I will touch on in a moment as well. So once all of that is sorted, you then have 3 categories to choose from: the level that you'll play on, the enemy faction that you'll fight, and the difficulty. Currently, after all of the updates that the multiplayer has received over the years, which there were quite a few of these, and they were all free additions as well, there are now 19 maps which take place on a wide variety of different areas from the base game. There are 4 enemy factions, the Cerberus, Geth, and Reapers, as well as the Collectors, which were added later on, and there are 4 difficulties. There's Bronze, Silver, and Gold, each of these getting progressively more difficult, with Gold presenting you with the largest number and variety of enemies of whatever faction you're facing. Those 3 were in the game at launch, and then they later added the Platinum difficulty, which is like Gold, but a little harder, and it mixes enemies from multiple factions at once instead of just picking a single faction to fight. So you either pick those parameters and start up a game yourself, or you can queue up to matchmake into a random party, and then off you go. Now, once you're in, again, the whole structure of the multiplayer is pretty basic. You start off at wave 1, you'll fight a few small groups of the most basic enemies of the faction you're up against. You take them all out, and then you move on to round 2. Here, they will then introduce you to another tier of enemy type, making things a little more interesting. And then, once you get to tier 3, you will be given your very first objective. Now, depending on the map, it can be one of those handful of varieties that I mentioned earlier. Essentially, though, you'll either have to stand in a spot, interact with some object, pick something something up or escort a drone. None of this is really too complicated. It's all pretty straightforward stuff. However, having that extra task in addition to dealing with what's now even more challenging mix of enemies, this keeps things pretty spicy. The progression keeps going and going from there as you move through rounds 4, 5, and 6, more enemies, harder enemies, and a new objective. And then by the time you're at the top tier of the match, rounds 7 through 10, the game is now throwing huge numbers of enemies, the hardest tier and type of enemies, and on the higher difficulties, this will include big groups of what are basically elites or like boss level characters. Some of these enemies are just ridiculous. They'll be very tanky. A handful of them have one-shot mechanics as well that you have to pay attention to. In a lot of cases, that just means don't let that massive creature anywhere near your body. And with all of this going on, those relatively simple tasks that you get every few rounds all of a sudden aren't so simple when you run the risk of getting melted if you're out in the open for too long, or getting one shot if some of those enemies get too close. And then finally, you have round 11. At this point, you are inundated with enemies. They're constantly spawning in. There's tons of the difficult ones. You just have to try to survive a couple of minutes and then make sure you are standing in the extraction circle once the timer hits 0. And that is it. That is the core, the base of the game. And like I said, it's all pretty simple. But now let's talk about what specific elements really made Mass Effect 3's multiplayer such a surprising and memorable experience that I was reminded of coming back to the game recently. I would say there are 3 main strengths that factor in here: the enemies, the playable characters, and the combat. So starting with the enemies, like I said, there are 4 factions to fight against. They started out with 3, they added a 4th later on. You shouldn't think for a second though that these are just reskins with the same generic enemy types. Like, each and every faction is very unique, not only visually, but in their style and how they fight. There are 8 to 10 enemy types for every one of the factions, and all of them require totally different strategies and tactics to how you survive and how you take them down. Every single enemy, even the most basic, those first few tiers of enemies of those 8 to 10 types per faction, even those require unique strategies depending on the type of health that they have, if they're going to be up in your face or at a range, and the type of damage you have to deal to them. All of that comes into effect. And while this is also the case for those basic enemies, the clearest examples of some of these differences are at the higher tier elite level. So let's take a look at a few of these. First off, with the Cerberus faction, you've got the Phantom. These are ninjas that flip around, are very slippery, incredibly hard to hit. They also fire semi-auto projectiles from a gauntlet. They have stealth, a super shield, and they can one-shot you with a sword if you let them get too close. Then there's the Atlas. This is a massive lumbering mech. It is super heavily armored, has devastating long-range missiles, which will really flush you out. And if you do get close, they have a large claw that will crush you, which is also an instant kill. On top of that, they can shoot out smoke grenades, which will obscure your vision from them and all of the other enemies, the more mid and lower tier ones that will be swarming around. Moving on to the Geth faction, there is like the Pyro, for example. They've got a short-range flamethrower that just completely melts shields, so you need to keep these guys at a distance. But they're also very tanky, protected by shields as well as armor, meaning that they take quite a bit of firepower and a mix of damage types to take down. And then there's the Geth Prime, god tier enemies, incredibly durable. They fire this pulse cannon that will just destroy you. They can call in missile drones and 2 gun turrets to support. The gun turrets themselves are devastating on those higher difficulties. And now on to the Reaper faction. We've got the brute, big, tanky creatures that will charge towards you and your group, swinging wildly, slamming with these huge, wide, arcing melee attacks. They have an instant death with this claw grab. And the Banshees, the most terrifying enemy, I would say, in all of the multiplayer, with this crazy shrill. They're also very tanky. They constantly teleport around in short distances, just non-stop blinking towards you, and flushing you out of cover, forcing you to move because they blink towards you so they can do their close range attacks. They've got this shout that's like an AoE Nova attack that even deals damage through terrain, so breaking line of sight doesn't save you. And they have a close range insta kill as well. So those are just a few examples of the enemies in the 3 factions from the base game. Like I said, there's 8 to 10 different enemy types for every faction, and all of them have a similar mix of strengths and weaknesses, of types of damage they deal, of types of defenses they have, and shield types. And then there was the Collectors, which is that further 4th faction that got added later on, and there's quite a few of these as well. Enemy variety, basically, to put it simply, is super impressive for such a simple multiplayer mode. There is a lot to keep track of. There's a lot to remember. Paying attention as you play to what enemy types are on the battlefield, where they are in relation to you, it it almost actually makes the small level size a strength of this mode, because you are never just feeling comfortable and at a distance like there's nothing to worry about. There is always something around every corner, in your line of sight, around your line of sight, that you have to be thinking about, listening for, and paying attention to where it is, how you should kill it, how you cannot die from it, and then where you need to be, whether you need to move, whether you need to approach, whether you need to cast your ability to break their shield, or it's a constant, just relentless, non-stop having to pay attention to all of these moving pieces. And then there are the characters themselves. So the base playable classes that I mentioned have like a general template to them. Every single one of the classes has a theme that kind of stretches out across the board. But all of these unlockable classes, in my opinion, add the most replayability to this multiplayer. Unlocking a new character and trying out their own unique combination of abilities and checking out their talent tree has been a huge motivating factor of me continuing to want to play. Every time I get a new character unlocked, I immediately want to jump in and try them out, try them with different weapons, try out their different abilities, figure out what kind of build I want to go for. Do I want to go spell focused, weapon focused? Do I want to do melee or tanky? There's so many different options between the fact that the characters each have their own abilities and what you choose within their skill tree. Everyone feels unique enough given their own suite of skills. I need this to be clear. Beyond those first basic ones, no two characters in the same class are alike at all. Each of them bring their own differences to the table. They all feel very, very unique. Let's take a look at some examples. One of my favorite classes is the Engineer. So the base Engineer, both of them have an Incinerate that will burn health and armor, an Overload ability, which is an electric shock that stuns enemies. It's good for shields, and they can summon a combat drone that will help attack and distract the enemy. However, the N7 Demolisher Engineer has a supply pylon that buffs shields as well as summons ammo and grenades. Then she has an arc grenade that stuns and electrocutes, which is effective against shields and barrier, and a homing grenade that tracks targets and does massive damage. So this character puts down this turret that resupplies and buffs your team's shields in a small radius, and then is just constantly tossing out these different types of grenades. And then there's the Quarian Defender Engineer. This character has a tactical scan, which will increase damage done and slow specific targets, has the Incinerate, which is the same ability as that base Engineer, and also has an arc grenade like the N7 Demolisher. So as you can see, it is a different combination of those first two. And then there's the Solarian Engineer, who has Incinerate, but also an energy drain that will steal barrier and shield power from an enemy, and they can summon a decoy to distract enemies, helping you and your teammates get away. And those are just 3 examples of the types of variety that each character can bring, and these are all Engineers. They're all the same class, but because of their different skills, because of how you can choose and go down different paths in their talent trees tied to those skills, but also tied to their defensive and offensive capabilities, there's so much variety here. And there are between 10 to 11 different playable characters for every one of the 6 classes. We're talking over 60 different characters to play and try out. It is a lot of variety, and that alone provides way more than enough interest to continue to play the game. But all of that is topped off with the game's combat. I would say it's pretty solid. It feels good, especially considering the time it came out. In 2012, this was a really good third-person multiplayer shooter with abilities, with skills. Nowadays, yeah, it's lacking a little bit. Modern-day games feel a lot better between the movement and the shooting, but I still think it holds up pretty well. Like, I've genuinely had a very fun time playing over the course of this past week. Most of the fun in playing comes down to the balance of finding when to attack and when to retreat, as I touched on with the different enemy types and all of their capabilities, their strengths. It's to the point, in fact, where on gold difficulty, and especially on platinum, you cannot run and gun. You will get melted. You have to time when you want to shoot, when you're going to buff your skills. You have to react to where the enemy is and what they're doing. It is a constant back and forth that can feel very, very satisfying. And then there's that extra layer of the different health types. I've mentioned these, but specifically there is health, armor, shields, and barriers. These are basically 4 different kinds of health bars. Each of them have different strengths and weaknesses. You see this in a lot of RPG shooter games. You see this in games like Destiny. Certain abilities and weapons will be good versus one type of health, but bad versus another. And learning that rock, paper, scissors to those mechanics adds just yet another element to the combat. And again, this was in 2012 when this first came out. At the time, it felt amazing. It was a lot of fun. It was a really, really engaging system. These are a lot of the strengths, but I want to talk about the weaknesses. And beyond the basic kind of structure of the multiplayer, beyond the small levels, the real problem is the loot boxes. It's just ridiculous. Loot boxes, and more loot boxes. This game not only has loot boxes, it has all of the loot boxes. The Recruit Pack, the Veteran Pack, the Spectre Pack, the Premium Spectre Pack, the Jumbo Equipment Pack, the Arsenal Pack, the Reserve Pack. What are all those packs? Well, they have absolutely everything and anything that you could possibly want in the game are all behind the packs. The new playable characters, the weapons, the weapon attachments, the consumables that you want to use on the matches, everything you want and need, all unlocked and progresses are gotten through the loot boxes. As you play, you will earn credits. The higher difficulties, the better you perform, the more credits you get. Those credits are then spent on whichever one of these 7 loot box variants you would like, where you have to roll the dice and just see what you get. So if there's a particular character that you want to play as or a weapon you want to use, the only way to get it is randomly through these loot boxes. You can't like save up credits and purchase it. You can't play a lot of the engineer class and unlock one of the engineers you want. You just have to hope you get it randomly through the loot boxes. Now, the different variations do help you narrow down the pool of potential drops. Like if you're looking for a rare character, you'll want to buy a reserves pack. If you want a rare weapon, you'll want to buy the arsenal pack. But still, all of the unlocks that you will be wanting are only found in these loot boxes. And frankly, it's gross, and it is the major issue and a huge stain on what was otherwise a totally fantastic, super enjoyable multiplayer game. And ultimately, I think that this is what hamstrung the mode long term and kept it from seeing success over the years. Frankly, I think if they had removed the loot box aspect from being the main form of progression, had they fleshed out the game a little more and released this as like a separate multiplayer Mass Effect experience, I think it could have been a massive game in and of itself. Because yeah, the core of it is solid. I just spent most of this video gushing about a lot of the really cool things, and it has a lot of fans, a lot of hardcore fans that are still playing to this day. 10 years later, it is the reason why I can still find matches instantly when I queue up. But burying all of the game's unlocks and progression behind random rolls and loot boxes, it's just a real shame. I don't know what else to say. And yet, here I am still absolutely loving this. So glad that they made this mode, that they put it in Mass Effect 3. As much as fans of the single player, the core component of the Mass Effect franchise, I get why they would be upset, but maybe for the sake of both of us, for the sake of how Mass Effect 3 turned out, and for the sake of this multiplayer mode, it's just a shame that we don't live in an alternate timeline where they could have been 2 different games. Mass Effect 3 comes out, and then they make this Mass Effect multiplayer that has this core, but more fleshed out, more to it, and without the loot boxes being the only form of progression. That is the world that I wish we lived in. We don't, and it's a shame, but man, this was definitely still something special that I really, really enjoyed. Before we go though, I want to once again thank the sponsor of today's video, Prime Gaming. Again, this is the service that's pretty straightforward. If you have Amazon Prime, Prime Gaming gives you a host of rotating games for free, as well as in-game items to collect for various titles. If you head to gaming.amazon.com, sign in with your Prime account, you'll get access to games like Rain World, Serial Cleaner, Gone Viral, and Metal Unit, as well as a ton of other indie titles. Those are all what is currently available. And then during Prime Day on July 12th and 13th, they'll be adding some AAA games like the Mass Effect Legendary Edition, Star Wars Republic Commando, Need for Speed Heat, Grid Legends, and Star Wars Jedi Knight, Jedi Academy, and Jedi Outcast. If you want to learn more about Prime Gaming, go ahead and check out that link in the video description below. But with that, we will wrap up this video. Thank you so much for joining me in a trip down memory lane. I knew that I loved Mass Effect's multiplayer, but I didn't quite recall all of the reasons why. I'm glad I went back to check it out because, yeah, it's as good as I remember. There are a lot of issues, but it's still also as good as I remember. Thank you for watching. As always, hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.